Welcome to a short introduction to American literature, the 19th century. In this presentation, we are going to talk about what is forming early 19th century literature, how it is connected to late 18th century literature, and how it really is part of this early nation-building period of American history. So early national literature, we're going to date this from about the 1780s to 1829. In terms of the historical context, what's going on during this time, why would we date it at the 1780s? You can see from this timeline, from the 1750s and 60s, we're still firmly in the colonial period. It wasn't until after the French and Indian War that Britain imposed the Stamp Act, which was really to pay for that war. And the political reaction is what starts to unite the colonies. And so in the 1770s, we get things like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and then finally in 1775, we have the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. In 1776, noticeably after the outbreak of the war, the Declaration of Independence is signed, and then we get in 1791, things like Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, really trying to communicate to a younger generation how it is that an American got to be who he was and where he was. And so when we talk about early national literature, we date it to after the Declaration of Independence, the end of the Revolutionary War, a time period where Americans, all of this stuff that has kind of been building up over the last 30 to 40 years comes to a head, and America begins to take on its own unique political and literary identity. In the 1780s, you see the completion of the Revolutionary War. You see in the early years of the new nation, things weren't going so well, and they needed a new constitution. In the late 1780s, George Washington becomes the first president. The Bill of Rights is ratified. These are all things that is like making America, America. And during this time period, perhaps not surprisingly, there's not a ton of American literature going on. It's really after this time of nation building, early nation building, that we get the emergence of a true national literature. All right, what are some things going on during this time? We have talked about the Great Awakening, this went on in the earlier part of, the First Great Awakening went on in the first part of the 18th century, which stressed really 5 dogmatic or religious points that changed the way Americans viewed themselves, their relationship to each other, their relationship to nature, their relationship to God. This leads into the religion and spirituality of the new era of nation building. There's really an intense focus on the business of building a new nation. Political writings are of paramount importance during this time. They're not those strictly speaking literature. We do have a lot of important documents from this time, like the Federalist Papers, but not so much. And we have a lot of like religious type of poetry and art from this time, some of which you saw a little bit of in Phyllis Wheatley's poetry, but we don't have a lot of clearly literary art. So what changed? Literary artists began to feel compelled to create a literature every bit as grand as the growing nation. To the nationalists, the possession of a first-rate literature of politics and a highly reputable literature of religion was not enough. So we have these two things. First-rate literature of politics, check, that already have that in America. Highly reputable literature of religion, check, have that in America. But in this early nation-building period, that was not seen as enough. If poetry, fiction, and drama were the marks of a great culture, America had to have them, and you see some artists self-consciously trying to step into that place. Phyllis Wheatley somewhat, Philip Freneau somewhat, but it's not until we get to one generation later of artists that we have people completely take on this new identity of American artists. Washington Irving is about a generation later than Freneau and Wheatley. And he is a major part of this impulse to create a uniquely American literature. Other figures from this time period that we won't be reading, but I just want you to know about them, would be Charles Brockden Brown and James Fenimore Cooper, two extremely influential novelists. Irving, though, had a unique and maybe we could call it slippery approach to the creation of a national literature, which we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's give you some context for Irving's time. During this time, we have kind of the end of the very beginning of the early nation building period, and some very important things are still happening, like the U.S. Library of Congress is founding. Thomas Jefferson becomes the third president, this famous anti-federalist. We have the Louisiana Purchase. We have Lewis and Clark setting off on an expedition in 1804. We have Madison becoming president, a famous Federalist. Right around this time is when we have Washington Irving create his History of New York, which is satirical, and he invents, weirdly, a fictional narrator to narrate it instead of doing it for himself. War of 1812, of course, is maybe what we might call the Second Revolutionary War, United States defending its independence against Great Britain. And then we have, with people like William Cullen Bryant, a new era of poetry begin. And then Andrew Jackson with his wars against the Indians, James Fenimore Cooper and his pioneer type literature is introducing us to this kind of push into the frontier that we see continue to develop into the 1820s. The United States enters a time period of self-confessed isolationism from Europe. They assert that the United States asserts that it is going to see itself as the power in the Americas, interfere, and the United States won't interfere with what happens in Europe. That continues until World War I. When Andrew Jackson is elected president in 1829, that's why we have this kind of sharp break in our timeline. It changes. It's a new era in American history, which we'll be talking about in the future. This is the expansion of executive power, the two-party political system, this laissez-faire economic system where the kind of engines of capitalism are allowed to take over and the government sort of stands back and steps out of it. And then most importantly, especially for literature, is the expansion of the Western frontier. Also in 1829, Edgar Allan Poe begins to publish, and with him, we also get a new era in American literature. It's no longer American literature where American authors are trying to create something that can compete with Europe. You have an American author who, frankly, has arrived, completely able to offer anything as good as what Europeans have. Religion during this early national period takes a unique development as well. We have a move away from the kind of Protestantism of the colonial and Revolutionary War period, and you see the development of deism, Unitarianism, Quakerism, and Methodism. All of these are reactions against Calvinism. Calvinism is the dominant religious strain of the Puritans. So for the deists, they accept the existence of a God and the human duty to worship this deity, and then that humans have moral and ethical obligations. You see this perfectly illustrated in Ben Franklin. Unitarians, which we'll see some examples of later, reject the Trinity and the deity of Christ, but they accept biblical authority otherwise. We're going to see this with Emerson in a little while. And then we're going to get to universalism and most importantly transcendentalism, which is a kind of uniquely American trend, combining religion with an American take on romanticism. Speaking of romanticism, what is it? Well, it's something that's already exists in Europe before it makes its way to the United States, but it's an extremely important cultural and intellectual development. It stresses the importance of strong emotional response to nature and art, as opposed to just human reason. It promotes the authority of the individual human imagination above that of the human reason. It's really a reaction against Enlightenment rationalism. So romantic artists become really concerned with things that elicit like really strong emotions, horror, terror, awe, because they're always trying to experience the sublime, those kinds of emotions that would help them access human emotions, human imagination. It's not always violent and dark, although romanticism kind of tends that direction, and it's the opposite of like plain history where the historian is just relating facts, kind of the opposite of maybe say Ben Franklin's autobiography. It's not concerned with depicting everyday life as it is. Instead, we're encouraged to roam free of the real and expected and experience and search for deeper truth. So this cultural and intellectual trend is highly connected with the Gothic. It's a subgenre that took on the setting of the sublime. So in Europe, this is like ruins of Gothic architecture, castles, abbeys, and etc. But in America, the Gothic setting is the wilderness, the frontier. So you see this especially like with Charles Brockden Brown, the author I mentioned before. The American Gothic has all of these kind of situations of individuals running into that which is frankly horrifying in the wilderness, but it's also these experiences that yield truth. We're going to see this when we read Nathaniel Hawthorne's short stories later in the semester. So where does Washington Irving fit into all of this? So Washington Irving, born in 1783, is a generation younger than like Phyllis Wheatley or Philip Freneau, or and even younger than that for Ben Franklin. But he is considered just kind of universally as the first American man of letters. Now, does not mean he's the best American man of letters, but he is the first. He was by trade a New York City lawyer. And then he had actually started a project with his brother of creating a history of New York City, but then some kind of personal tragedies interfered, and then he went on later just to sort of create his own history, not of New York City, strictly speaking, but of the Dutch time in New York. And Washington Irving did this weird thing, where he wrote all of these, first of all of this history using a fake persona as the narrator. But it's not like he told people that, oh, I'm going to adopt a fictional narrator. No, he just wrote it like he was that fictional person. And then he basically staged a hoax to introduce the book. But like several weeks before he published this book chapter by chapter, he published fake notices in the newspapers of New York City. They were allegedly posted by a landlord in search of a missing person described as a small, brisk-looking old gentleman. And the landlord said in order to recuperate the costs of rent that was never paid, he would be publishing the papers left behind by this old man. And then several weeks later, those were published, and people thought they were by this little old man who had gone missing, but it was really Washington Irving all along. So the history of New York, it's satirical, it's funny, it's comic, it's also slightly true. A lot of it is just like slightly altered last names to like make fun of prominent families and that kind of thing. And some people at the time loved it. Some people at the time hated it. It was discovered to have been written by Irving and not by Dietrich Knickerbocker. And it's funny that a lot of the things from the history of New York, you can still see influenced New York to this day. Like Gotham City is always New York City's alter ego in fiction, like in the Batman series and comics and things like that. Also, the New York Knicks are named after Knickerbockers. So a lot of things from Washington Irving persist to this day in New York. So what specifically about the Legend of Sleepy Hollow? So History of New York was a comic history of the Dutch in New York State. It was sort of well received. Some people liked it. Some people hated it. Some people really thought it was hilarious. Some people were offended. Irving then traveled to England after the War of 1812. And there he was encouraged by some sort of leading English authors of the day to continue to work and continue to publish. And so he published the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. And you can see Geoffrey Crayon there, yet another fictional persona for the real Washington Irving author to hide behind. So he adopts like a whole new tone and a whole new person for these stories. Again, it's a mix of satire, fact, and fiction. And it's in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon that we have the short stories The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, which also take place in historical upstate New York. In The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, it is a ghost story, but it's not like a straight up ghost story. It's also comedy, a satirical comedy. It's fake history. A lot of these names that are in the story, like Katrina Van Tassel, is based on a real person who lived in upstate New York, a real woman from history. Then you have some fake people like Ichabod Crane. Ichabod literally means the glory has departed, like the glory of God has departed. So by giving this guy a name like that, he's indicating like, what a loser. But he is the type of American, like the American city slicker, right? This guy who comes in with his fancy education and his fancy clothes, but everyone local is like, give me a break. You have Brom Bones, who's basically this type of the American country boy. Katrina Van Tassel, the woman between these two men who actually plays her part pretty well. The Headless Horseman, is it a character? Is it not? The ghostly atmosphere of upstate New York. I don't want to spoil the story for you, but if you're hoping for like an actually creepy story, the only really creepy thing about this story is the ghostly atmosphere of upstate New York as it's described in the story. Everything else is comic and satirical, which you can explore that as you read it for yourself. All right. I'm going to end this video now, but I want to direct your attention to this short video on these slides, which will be available to you, explaining the setting and inspiration for this story. In this video, you'll see some of the actual sites, some of the things like gravestones where Washington Irving would have gotten the inspiration for the like historical part of the story. But keep in mind, it's fiction, it's satire, it's comedy. He's making fun of people and places and ideas. And that's the weird thing about Washington Irving. He's never straightforward. He's a very slippery author and narrator. He never presents himself. He's always writing using a persona between himself and the reader. And so, yeah, he's the first American man of letters, but in terms of who is he really, what did he really care about, it's hard to pin down. That's part of the enigma of Washington Irving.